Joining us now is Minnesota Congresswoman Michele Bachmann. Congresswoman, thank you for being here. And your first question comes from Scott Pruitt.
Good evening, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
You've been a strong opponent of the President's federal health care law, as we have been. And it's been because, primarily, I trust, because of the individual mandate. But you've also went so far as to say that the states cannot pass an individual mandate. They lack the authority. What's your constitutional basis for that?
Well, I think it goes back to the liberty interest that each one of us inherently has. And there can be reasonable disagreement on that issue. I think the overriding issue that I want the American people to realize is that if we do absolutely nothing, Obamacare will be implemented, and it's going to change the face of the country forever. It's going to cost trillions of dollars over the years. It's going to take away our liberty. It could have the potential of collapsing Medicare because it takes $500 billion out of Medicare. And it's also, for the first time in the history of the country, it has taxpayer-subsidized abortion. It really is the new social engineering playground of the left, and it has to be stopped. One thing I'd like to mention is in August of this year, President Obama, in a stunning level of power, demonstrated how far a president can go with Obamacare, because he ordered every private insurance company in the United States to now offer free of charge the morning after abortion pill, contraceptives, and on and on. And so this is it. And what I want people to know is we have one chance to get rid of this bill, and it's in this election cycle.
But Congresswoman, I want to really understand, Virginia passed a statute saying that no one could be forced to buy health insurance in the state of Virginia. We passed a constitutional amendment saying the same thing in Oklahoma. Are you saying that that was unnecessary, that the states didn't have the authority to do that anyway?
No, you certainly had the authority to pass that statute. The problem is, as both of you know, the federal government Obamacare bill will trump the state statutes. You did the right thing. What you did is you demonstrated that this is the opinion of the people in Oklahoma, the people of Virginia. You don't want to come under that federal government restriction. I agree with that. But the problem is, it is the law of the land right now. And if we do nothing, it's going to continue to steamroll every state that there is. I don't want to see socialized medicine, the law of the land. And fundamentally, it's the foundation for socialized medicine.
Yeah, Bobby.
Congresswoman, thank you for being here. You pledged to deport all 11 million illegal aliens. Homeland Security tells us that will cost $135 billion. Tell us first how you plan to pay for that and how you will execute that plan.
Well, first of all, I want people to know that there is a cost already to having illegal aliens in the United States. It costs us, the taxpayers, $113 billion every year, and $32 billion of that cost is absorbed by the states. And that actually works out to about $1,000 per American household. It's a very real cost. And I agree, this is the thorniest, most difficult issue in dealing with illegal immigration. What about deportation? I believe that we should uphold the laws of the land, which does include deportation. How do we pay for it? The American taxpayer will have to pay for it.
And what is your plan for executing it?
For executing that?
Yes,
well,
for carrying out the plan.
Okay, good question. It would be enforcement both at the border but also by the ICE agents. Right now, essentially, our ICE agents, those are the agents in the interior of the country who are tasked with enforcing the laws. They're not enforcing them. And we also have sanctuary cities now where they don't enforce the laws either on deportation. I think what we simply need to do is just start enforcing those laws, which we aren't doing, and then begin the process of deportation.
And as Attorney General of the state of Florida, my fear is that that money will get dumped on my state.
I don't blame you. And it must not, because if you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, what Congress can do, a specific enumerated power is that the government needs to deal with securing with the border. That is the federal government's role. It's not the state's role. And so it's very important that it's the federal government that pays for this cost. That's been the burden. As I said, the cost every year is $113 billion, but the states are bearing $82 billion. The federal government needs to to pay for the deportation costs.
Congresswoman Bachmann, congressional Republicans all but uniformly support tort reform, but you're a strong believer in a limited federal government. Currently, there's a bill before Congress, Senate Bill 197, that would allow the federal government to dictate how state judges are to try medical malpractice cases and cap what awards can be given by juries under state law. Do you support that bill?
I support tort reform absolutely, because frivolous lawsuits are out of control. There is an issue with the 10th Amendment. I recognize that. Some states have implemented caps on the frivolous lawsuits and lawsuits that come forward. One state is California.
Well, let me zero you in, though.
Sure.
You support tort reform, so do I, but do you support federal tort reform that governs how states may conduct their medical malpractice trials?
I can come out in support of that. This is an issue that I think is a fundamental issue, and it's something that I can support.
Okay. We will continue with Congresswoman Michele Bachmann right after the break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to continue with Minnesota Congresswoman Michele Bachmann. This question comes from Scott Pruitt.
Congresswoman, you've called for the abolition of the Department of Education. Some have criticized calls to eliminate the Department of Education as being purely symbolism. Would the abolition of the Federal Education Department alone be enough to get the federal government out of education from your perspective?
Oh, absolutely not. I would abolish the Department of Education. That's how I got into politics in the first place. We had foster children. I was very concerned about their education. We also need to have a full-scale repeal of the federal education law. That's really what needs to be done, because it's the burdens and the mandates that the federal government have put on our local school districts. And I've asked superintendents, especially in Iowa, I said, if I was able to repeal all of the federal education law and do away with the Federal Department of Education, and you wouldn't get the money that the federal government sends down to you, would you take that deal? And they've said to me, absolutely, we'd take that deal, because the amount of money that we get from the federal government doesn't even begin to cover the costs of all the mandates they put on us. And we can't forget, we didn't have a Federal Department of Education before the late 1970s, so we can certainly get along without it.
You've said you'd abolish the EPA, but as a practical matter, how would you deal with something like air pollution that crosses state lines?
Well, it's a good question. We already have 50 EPAs. Every state has one, but there are issues between the states. And in that case, I think on a case-by-case basis, then the federal government gets involved, whether it's clean air or clean water, or if it's on our international border and we need to deal with other nations. More on a case-by-case basis. But what we can't have is the current Department of EPA right now. They have essentially become a government to themselves almost, and they are changing the course of history every day.
I certainly agree with you about the aggressiveness, over-aggressiveness of the EPA, but as a practical matter, you've said now on a case-by-case basis, you don't mean that you would pass a law for every instance of a coal plant in Ohio's, pollution coming into Pennsylvania and then something else from one state to another, do you?
That's
Is that
right.
what you intend?
Well, legislation is one thing and negotiation is another. And I think that a lot of these issues can be negotiated because, again, if it's a state, let's say it's the two states that you mentioned, the two states can get together.
But you cannot just negotiate without a legal foundation and thereby compel both sides to participate. You can't do that. So what is if they won't negotiate, then what?
Well, you're making a very good point. I think that when we send the power and the authority back to the states, that's the place to begin. But there may be a need for new legislation that comes forward, or there may be a limited role within another department to be able to take care of it. I'm not opposed to the federal government. It's certainly reasonable that the federal government would have to deal with some of these issues, but let's look at what we're talking about with the EPA. Right now, they want to impose a brand new tax because of cap and trade. They're changing our economy. They're literally writing rules and taking over businesses because of what's happening with the EPA, because they're putting so many heavy burdens and requirements.
You're talking to a crowd here that are all suing the EPA in one way or another.
Thank you very much. I'm all very proud of you.
What we're trying to get at is your alternative. I think you you've probably addressed that. So thank you.
I'm not opposed to new legislation to deal with that, again, on a case-by-case basis, or if we have to have a very modified form. But the current EPA has to go.
We're at less than 2 minutes for the segment. Pam Bondi, you have the next
I
question.
think you'll enjoy this as a practicing lawyer, Congresswoman Bachmann. One of my favorite questions. Other than Roe versus Wade, what is the worst United States Supreme Court decision in the last 50 years?
In the last 50 years, I would say that the all-time worst was the Dred Scott decision. But I think that in the last 50 years, there are so many, it is hard to choose. But I'll go with the Kelo decision. The Kelo decision offended me tremendously because it was a government entity taking away the private property interests from one individual because it would benefit government in the form of revenue, and then giving that private property to another. That's a terrible decision.
So, Congresswoman, in that regard, what would you do from the federal government's perspective to protect private property?
To protect private property, well, the federal government needs to stand up in terms of legislation, and also from the legal perspective. If there's a case that goes before the court, they need to follow the Constitution, and they also need to have reference with the Declaration of Independence, because that's part of our government, that we uphold private property rights. That hasn't happened a lot in recent years, but it must.
We are in the final 30 seconds of the segment. Pam Bondi, do you have a final question?
I have a quick question, and Kelo is one of my top ones as well, Congresswoman. You've expressed support for a federal human life amendment. Why is it preferable to allowing the states to have their own policy on abortion?
Because life is the fundamental issue. If you go back to the Declaration of Independence, we have inalienable rights. Those are rights that God gives to us, not man. And so the reason why governments were instituted, according to the Declaration of Independence, was to protect those inalienable rights, which includes life.
Thank you very, very much, Congresswoman Michele Bachmann.
Thank you.
And we'll also see the Congresswoman at the end of the forum for her final minute. Our next candidate is Congresswoman Michele Bachmann. Congresswoman.
Well, this is the most important election of our lifetime. We have a chance to take our country back in 2012. We were promised in 2008 hope and change. We didn't get hope and change in the way that we thought we would. This is our chance to have real hope and real change. As President of the United States, I'm going to unite our country. I'm going to grow the economy. I know how to do that as a tax attorney and also as a business owner. But I think even more importantly, we have to realize we have some hard, significant work to do. But that hard work will pay off, because it will pay off in the form of millions of new jobs being created. It will pay off in terms of growing the economy, legalizing American energy production, and bringing down the price of gasoline. We can do all this and have the hope that we want for our children. We can do it if we stand together, and I'll unite our country.
Thank you, Congresswoman.